Jim Hannick here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos Reyes and Christopher Zender. This week, we discuss the direction of the Catholic Church, especially in the United States, and the currents of thought and action that shape her direction. Our welcome guest is Larry Chapp. He taught theology for 2 decades at DeSales University. Currently, he owns and manages, with his wife Carrie, the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm in Harveys Lake, Pennsylvania. He's the author of Scientific Naturalism and its Challenge to the Christian Faith. Let's begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit, we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Amen. Larry, you just recovered from COVID.
Yes,
Could you tell us about that and what lessons it brought?
Well, I'll start by saying, yeah, I had COVID. My wife did too, and a whole bunch of our friends at church, which is probably where we caught it. We had COVID about 2 months ago. And in my case, it was, I'm not vaccinated, by the way, which I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I just decided to roll the dice and take my chances with natural immunity and possibly catching COVID rather than take the vaccine. You're talking to a guy here who doesn't like to inject things into his body unnecessarily. I don't even take a flu shot every year. So like I said, I'm not into conspiracy theories, but I had questions about the vaccine. And so I just rolled the dice and I was glad that I did. I don't necessarily counsel that for everyone, but because in my case, the COVID was very mild. I essentially had a kind of a bad sinus infection for about 5 days. It was it never went into my lungs. I just had fatigue and a bad headache for about 5 days. I did lose my sense of taste and smell, but that came back quickly and I bounced back quickly. My wife had it a little harder. She had an irritating cough, which hung on for about a month, but she too recovered quickly, as did everybody at church that had it. So for us, it was a relatively benign experience. Not that it is for everyone. I have a friend who was actually in the hospital for 30 days with COVID. It can be quite nasty, I agree. But thankfully, with God's grace, I was not afflicted with the worst symptoms.
And you'd be willing to roll the dice again?
Yes, I think that I would. Simply
after
because,
all, we're going to have variant 27 soon.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the problems that I have with the vaccine. I mean, I know doctors who don't take the vaccine. And once again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but one of the things that my doctor friends tell me is that they think they're very suspicious of a vaccine for a coronavirus in particular, because coronaviruses are known to mutate heavily. And so what we end up with is a prospect of endless booster shots, booster after booster. And every single time there's a new variant of the disease, yet another vaccine has to come out. And so from what a lot of my doctor friends are telling me, and some of them work in immunology, that they would rather see our national resources go towards developing effective treatments for COVID rather than trying to forestall it up front with ever elusive vaccines that don't give you a whole lot of protection from the virus to begin with, all kinds of breakthrough. Now, I think if I had some comorbidity factors, if I was, diabetic or had a bad heart or emphysema or those, I would definitely take the vaccine. But I'm rolling the dice again and hoping for the best.
What if you were 75?
Yeah, well, my parents are octogenarians. My father is 88, and I recommended that both of them get the vaccine, and they did. So I'm only 63.
Oh,
So I am,
kid, a kid,
I'm a mere babe. So,
right.
I think that if I were in my 70s, I think I would probably take the vaccine. Yes, because then the roll of the dice is not so not so reliable, I think.
Well, that gives us a perspective, a personal perspective from a personal experience. Mario, you want to take us forward?
Well, yes, I was very struck by your story that you live on a farm and following Dorothy Day model. How
Yes.
then you make this transition, this decision to go from an academic to a farmer?
Well, it's there was no road to Damascus moment. I was not knocked off my comfortable horse by Christ in a flash and decided, I know, I'm just going to change gears. It was a gradual evolution. In my teaching at DeSales University, which is near Allentown, Pennsylvania, I taught primarily undergraduates, almost exclusively undergraduates, which I loved doing, and I was pretty good at it. And one of the things that I noticed in my teaching is that, and it was a wide group of people demographically. This was not a group, these undergrads were all the cross section of religious and non-religious types. And I just found that often what resonated with them in very, very profound ways was the church's social teaching on all kinds of issues. And then when I started teaching them about Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement, because I was always interested in her perspective and in her life. And I found many, many students really coming alive and wanting to know where they could find a Catholic worker house and what they could do. And I started teaching it more and more. But then, and my wife also has a PhD in theology, and she was interested in Dorothy Day. And one of our students, a guy who's now a priest, Father John Gribowich, was a big Dorothy Day fan. And he became eventually like an adopted son for us because, he lost both parents and so on. And he really became part of our family. And it was actually as his father was dying and he was staying with us that we started talking about how all of us independently in prayer were getting the same movement of the Holy Spirit in our hearts. We had to discern that spirit, but it was very telling that all three of us at the same time were getting the same movement, that we needed to do something more radical with our lives. I was feeling it because, the life of a college professor, especially once you're a full professor and fully tenured, it's pretty cushy. And I was making a good salary. I had a nice home in the woods, and I could teach my courses in autopilot, for crying out loud, at that point in my career. And so I wasn't being stretched. I wasn't being challenged. And even though I was good at what I was doing, there was this dissatisfaction within me that I needed to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And I just kept coming back in prayer to the Catholic worker movement, And all three of us in conversation when John's dad was passing away came to the same conclusion. Let's find and buy a small farm and try to live the vision of Dorothy Day and Peter Morn. Peter Morn was her co-founder of the movement, and he was the real brains behind the idea of the Catholic worker farms. And so we took the plunge. At first, I was going to keep teaching and do but I found that it was too hard. It was too difficult, too dissonant, and so I had to choose. And I was really torn because I loved teaching. I still do. But my wife finally convinced me, no, God has brought us down this path. And if you can't do both, you need to retire from teaching. And I did.
Can I just do a quick interjection? I know Christopher's going to have a lot to say, but are you telling us you loved faculty meetings?
That is that a rabbit hole you really want me to go down?
Why not?
Look, I was known at DeSales University to be a complete pain in the administration's petard, and I I used to joust at windmills at faculty meetings and department meetings and really gained quite a reputation for myself. But at the end of the day, after I was there for about 15 years, I decided this is getting me nowhere. The university doesn't respect me anyway. I wasn't getting decent pay raises anymore, precisely because of my outspokenness, and the president of the university was a vindictive man. And so I decided, you know what? I'm just going to teach and do my scholarship. I quit going to faculty meetings.
Uh-huh.
I just quit going. In fact, the provost of the university once confronted me and said, Larry, it's a contractual obligation that you are supposed to attend faculty meetings. So I looked her square in the face. I said, so fire me. Go ahead. I dare you. Fire me. And of course, she laughed and she didn't fire me because that would have been a $300,000 settlement out of court for them. And despite the contractual violation. So anyway, that's my story. In other words, you bring up an important issue, which was even though I love teaching, modern higher education has gone down a very nasty path. And we could talk for an hour and a half just on what's wrong with modern higher education. And so it was part of my dissatisfaction, not just that the lifestyle was too cushy and not challenging enough, and it wasn't, but that I was just simply fed up and disgusted with the direction that especially Catholic higher education was heading.
Candor. All right. I
Yes.
just wanted to interject that. Sorry.
Well, great interjection.
Okay. Well, Christopher?
I'm curious. My wife and I had the farming itch when we lived in California. We ended up buying 5 acres in the mountains. I planted over 24 fruit trees, had chickens, had goats, a 6,000 square foot garden. And I found it's really difficult to live in the agricultural life. I mean,
it is.
How good a farmer do you think you are? I was not a very good one. How good a farmer do you think you are?
Oh, I'm a terrible farmer. In fact, my wife calls me the YouTube farmer because even though I grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska, so a lot of people just assume, oh, you're from Nebraska, you must know a lot about farms. No, I grew up in the city, and I hated the rural aspects of Nebraska. Like I was in seminary. One seminary prof who was Irish once said to me, "You Nebraskans are all alike. You love your homeland and you can't wait to get out of it." And that was me. That was me, so I didn't know a lot about farming at all. And so anytime I wanted to know how to do something, I just went to YouTube. How do you butcher a chicken? Well, there's a little video shows you how to butcher a chicken. How do you plant potatoes? Well, here's a video on how to plant potatoes. And so, I learned on the fly. And one of the things I have learned, which is something that a friend of mine told me, who is a farmer, right before I got started, and it's really been driven home. She said to me, expect failure. If there's one thing a farmer has to be ready to do, is to simply expect failure, even in things that you have invested all kinds of blood, sweat, and toil in. And at the end of the day, it all ends up for naught. And you have to be willing to put up with that and not get angry or despondent. We just have 11 acres, and we're primarily focused on both raising produce to give away to soup kitchens, food pantries, that kind of thing. But our huge focus also is on raising sheep. My wife shears the sheep, processes their fleece, spins the wool into yarn, and teaches other people how to spin and process fleece. So, and that's a big draw for our farm, is teaching what Peter Morn called these kinds of artisanal skills. And we're much better at teaching artisanal skills like this, like canning and, spinning, those kinds of things, than I am with growing crops. Primarily because I'm one lazy person and I don't like manual labor very much. And as you had a 6,000 garden or whatever,
yeah.
You know how much weeding has to go on.
Even in California.
The weeding. And of course, we have chickens and pigs and those things too. One thing, to expect failure, the chickens are vexing. I don't know about you, but everything likes to kill and eat chickens. And so it's always a constant battle against predators when you have chickens. And so that's been a source of both failure and some triumph as well.
Yeah, I could tell you chicken death stories, which should.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
I once raised meat ducks too, and then came up one day to our upper field where I had the ducks, only to see a golden eagle feasting on like 4 of them
Oh,
that it had dispatched, and thinking, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful bird though. It was just a gorgeous animal, that golden eagle.
Because it eats duck.
Yeah, that's right.
So what do you think, when you're talking about this, you're talking about expect failure. It almost seems to be something we could actually say about the church, right?
Oh, absolutely. The cross-referencing there isn't indirect; it's direct. I have, like I said, I was in seminary for 7 years, both minor seminary, major seminary. I was 2 months away from ordination to the priesthood when I decided, no, I'm a laicized deacon, transitional deacon. Decided I wanted to pursue an academic life, get married, those kinds of things. And so then I went and got my doctorate at Fordham, and then proceeded right into Catholic higher education. So my point in this ramble is that, yeah, I am immersed in the church. I've spent my entire adult life working for the church in some capacity, and the ability of the church to disappoint is almost bottomless. And it is something that, in fact, I'm writing a blog post right now kind of on this topic of what a disappointment the church can be to us.
That goes for
well,
Vatican II, I
I'm sorry, go
suppose.
ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
So that goes back. Yeah, that's when you think of Vatican II, because you've done a lot of writing on Vatican II. That seems to be the case. The new springtime that was supposed to occur following the council.
Yeah, it did not happen. Didn't happen because I mean, I love Vatican II and I accept it. I'm not a radical traditionalist who blames in post hoc ergo propter hoc fashion every bad thing that happened after the council. I don't blame it on the council. But the council does bear some of the blame for what came after. And I've written that I think the council was guilty of a double naivete. I think the council fathers were naive about the internal strength of the church's faith life up to the council. I think, it looked at all the buildings and vocations, and the church was busting its seams in so many ways, and really started to think, this church is robust. It is filled to the brim with faith and holiness and so on. And even as Joseph Ratzinger pointed out in his famous 1958 article, the new paganism of the church, he was already ringing the alarm bells in 1958, saying, wait a minute, there's a lot of rot here. And if you look at even literary figures like George Bernanos, Francois Mauriac, people like that, they were ringing the alarm bell already in the 30s, saying, wait a minute, there's a lukewarmness here, deep down things that's going to come back to bite us if we don't address this. So I think the council fathers didn't pay a sufficient attention to the problems of faith that were in the church, and I think naively thought that it could just throw open the windows of the church, open up the church's treasury, and that people were going to come flocking to the church, and instead of living the faith life out of obedience to the hierarchy, they were going to live it spontaneously as free adults, appropriating the faith in a non-infantilized way. But that then points out the second naivete, which was, I think the council fathers were somewhat naive about just how toxic modern culture is to the faith. And I think they thought in opening the windows that only the good aspects of our culture would come in, and the church would have the internal strength to filter out all the bad stuff from our culture, that the laity were mature enough to know the difference between the good and the bad aspects of our culture. But as the Protestant theologian Karl Barth pointed out, the church opened the windows expecting fresh air to come in, and a hurricane blew in instead, because the council fathers were naive about the cultural revolution that was upon us. And so this perfect storm of factors entered in, and I think that there was a double naivete in the council that contributed to that. The actual documents themselves are, I think, quite beautiful and say a lot of wonderful things. but they didn't really move the needle very much. And pretty much what remained in place was a church that had adopted a sort of ecclesiology of power rather than an ecclesiology of service. And all that happened was the notion of power shifted from the hierarchy to priests and the laity, who then simply saw the council as a green light to sort of grab hold of the reins of power themselves in very unfortunate and distorting ways, which is what we saw after the council.
I'd like to go back a bit to the Catholic worker.
Sure.
What should I say? The ravages of the culture have certainly affected the Catholic worker. And I want to say that Dorothy Day was a student of Catholic intellectuals like Jacques Maritain and Emmanuel Mounier. Are there intellectual mentors for today's Catholic worker, or are they, in many cases, woke without knowing that there was a woke well before there was woke?
Well, you're really good at opening up rabbit holes here, because this is fantastic. It's one of my chief complaints about the modern Catholic worker movement is that with some exceptions, I am in contact with many Catholic workers who are trying to retrieve Dorothy and Peter's vision of a more with a stronger Catholic sensibility. But
we've had Sean Dominique on the show before.
Oh, yes. And he's one of he and I have just completed a manifesto that we're going to,
manifesto of the mad farmer.
That's right. That we're going to Sean and I are going to publish this manifesto soon, which is a broad statement about the state of the church today, but is also an attempt to retrieve Dorothy and Peter's vision for the Catholic worker movement. Because the broader Catholic worker movement is now, for the past 50, 60 years, simply gone the way of so many other aspects of the church, down the path of trendy, lefty, like you said, woke things. And I mean, there is some merit in that. The people that I've met in the movement who think this way are good people. I mean, my God, they put me to shame with regard to their sense of service and charity and love of the poor and all that. So I don't want to be overly harsh with them. These are really good people, holy in their own way, but they are altogether captive of modern secularity, modern leftist ideas, and it is having a very distorting effect on the Catholic worker movement. So much so, in fact, that oftentimes when I walk into certain Catholic circles that are more conservative, they're automatically suspicious of me because of my association with the Catholic worker movement. They all think Dorothy Day was a communist, that Dorothy Day was a liberal, that Dorothy Day was a dissenter, and she wasn't. My goodness, she bought into everything, even the church's harder teachings on sexuality. She bought into them hook, line, and sinker. And this is what we're trying to retrieve, because the worker movement has, in many ways, gone off the rails theologically, and they have abandoned her Catholic vision. Because you're right, and there are no, I don't see anyway, from my perspective, I don't see any intellectual Catholic guides for the modern Catholic worker movement. I'm trying to be that in my own small way, but I'm probably too small of a fish to make much of a ripple in the pond. So, but I'm trying, and but there are very few voices out there who are trying.
Here's a compare and contrast for you. The Zwicks in Houston,
yes,
have done a lot to bring forward the intellectual legacy of the Catholic worker movement. And of another sort, I've just started a dialogue with one of my earliest mentors in the movement, now turned the ripe old age of 84, Carl Meyer of Chicago.
Oh, yes.
And that's a different kettle of fish altogether. I mean, there's a wide range of workers. And I'm glad that you recognize the need for intellectual grounding. And I don't care how small a fish you are, you're swimming in the right direction.
Yeah, the Swicks have been very good at this. I mean, Mark sadly passed away of cancer like 5 years ago or so now, I think.
Yeah.
And Louise is getting on in years herself. But I used their book on the Catholic worker movement in my classes, right? And it's a very good book, and they're doing their bit. But on the other hand, they are pretty marginal. I mean, Mark, and when he was alive, and now Louise, they're pretty marginalized figures in the broader Catholic worker movement. They are largely viewed as reactionary people that most Catholic workers really, they will acknowledge that the Swicks have done great work at their worker house in Houston with the immigrants, but they disavow the Swicks Catholicism is just way too reactionary.
Well, let's go
Yes.
forward, Mario.
Well, I think in order to go forward, we need to go backward. But talking about the recovery of the memory of the worker movement, I find a lot of similarities between what is happening today in Latin America and the worker movement, which is we are losing the meaning of what Catholic, the integral humanism is. And so you read what is happening in Chile and many other countries where Christian democracy was really flourishing in the 1960s and 70s. Today is completely gone. And one figure who was key in understanding and creating this atmosphere of this Christian Democratic Party was Jacques Maritain. Now,
Yes.
today, rarely that even the bishops know who he was. So, and when you just propose to retrieve the figure of Jacques Maritain, you are on the one side of radical traditionalists accused of being an extreme liberal, or on the other side, you've been accused of being quite conservative. So you are in a very difficult position. So I think he's a forbidden figure mainly at Catholic universities. And so, but I think if you follow him and his relationship with the worker movement, with political leaders, and I think he can give at least some good point to start with and building a new movement, so to speak. So my question is more pedagogical. Since you have been teacher for all these years, what would be the best tool to recover a figure like Maritain or Mounier or many others thinker of that stature?
I think that it has to begin with a very robust retrieval and teaching of proper philosophy and theology. And by proper, I don't necessarily mean magisterially approved and neo-scholastic and all that. But I mean, students need to be taught, people in general need to be taught, once again, of the value of philosophy and theology, and to be taught how to think philosophically and theologically. A Maritain isn't even read by most people. Even if I were to say, here, this is a great book on, proper relations between church and state and how to construct a Christian civilization that isn't oppressive and confessional and all those things, most people would say, thanks, but no thanks. I have no interest in reading all that metaphysical gobbledygook. And the same goes true. The problem is people don't think philosophically and theologically. They think in the binaries of these political categories, which is exactly what you said is true with regard to the radical traditionalists dismiss you because you're apparently a liberal, and the liberals dismiss you because you're apparently a conservative, but that only betrays the fact that they're not thinking philosophically and theologically. They're thinking simply in these binary political categories. And that therein, I run into this all the time, not with Maritain, but with the thinkers that I am, the ressourcement theologians, the Nouvelle Theologie, like Hans von Balthasar, Joseph. I did my dissertation on von Balthasar. I've written extensively on Ratzinger, Bouillet, Congar, Chenu, all of these guys from the middle part of the century. And what I find is that in traditionalist circles, I'm considered a hopeless liberal. In liberal circles, I'm considered a reactionary nut job from the inferno. And it's almost impossible to make headway against these arguments, precisely because the only argument that can be made is our philosophical and theological ones, and nobody wants to hear those arguments. So it's almost as if the church has to undergo a revolution in its mind and heart in order for it now, for the average person, for the average Catholic intellectual, to be more open to philosophical and theological arguments and constructions, because as it stands right now, they simply are not. And you know, I mean, if you're involved in academia, you run into these massive roadblocks all the time. These intellectual roadblocks. You know, they ask you a question, you start to answer it with a philosophical or theological answer, and they just wave their hand and say, "Well, I don't want to hear any of that." Well, darn it, that's my answer. You know, and if you don't want to hear it, then I'm sorry, we have nothing to talk about. And so how do we go about this? How do we put flesh on these bones? How do we make significant change in the church? Slowly, one grain of sand at a time, one drip of water at a time, just down there in the trenches, not giving up, sticking to our guns, because I tell you what, our day will come. Our day will come, if it is not coming soon already, as the civilizational collapse that is around us will cry out for a different paradigm, cry out for a different model of discourse. And then we will be heard again someday. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but someday.
Larry, if it's any consolation, during this time in which we're waiting, we're also taking names.
I know I am.
Extensive file system.
I always tell people, never make me a bishop or, God forbid, the Pope, because there would be so many heads rolling down the steps of the Mayan pyramids. I mean, I would be blood sacrificing people left and right. And yeah, I would be an altogether inappropriate choice for a position of leadership in the church, because there would be scores to settle, and I would settle.
Well, Larry, we intend to be more discreet. But it all begins with the database.
Yeah, these days it's not a priest lopping off heads; it's a spreadsheet on a database. Yeah.
On a serious note, you have underscored, as have the Schindlers, the absolutely pivotal importance of Gaudium et Spes number 22.
Yes.
To wit, the truth is that only in the mystery of the incarnate word does the mystery of man take on light. Could you tell us about it, expand on it?
Yes. For starters, I mean, that is the name of my blog, Gaudium et Spes 22.com. And I chose that obviously deliberately in order to highlight the fact that I think that section of the council, not just that section of the document, but that section of the whole, is the hermeneutical key to the entire council, which is why Pope John Paul II quotes it in almost every encyclical that he ever wrote, if not every encyclical. And Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict Emeritus, has identified it as the Christological bombshell, the Christological dynamite that sits right there in Gaudium et Spes is the key to the entire council, because what the council was attempting to do, at least in part, was to propose a form, go back to Maritain again, of Christian humanism to combat the atheistic, secularized humanism of our age. Remember, these were men who had survived World War II and its dehumanization. We're currently living in the Cold War and the communist dehumanizations. And Henry de Lubac had written his famous book, The Drama of Atheist Humanism. And that quote in Gaudium et Spes 22 is really a de Lubacian quote. He is the one who originally came up with the idea that, I mean, it's not his main idea, but his phraseology, that if in fact Christ is the center of all of human history, then in point of fact, there is no way that you can understand what a human being is, even on a worldly level, even on a natural level, except in the light of Christ. There's no such thing as this bifurcated analysis of a human being where, okay, we'll study it from the perspective of the human sciences in a purely secular way. And then if you want to add on a bunch of spiritual sentimentalism, feel free to do so. No, it's that theology isn't gravy on the secular potatoes. It's gravy all the way down, baby. And that's the main point of Gaudium et Spes 22. If you want to understand the world, humanity, history, everything, the meaning of existence, you have to look to Christ. And Christ is the hermeneutical key to understanding humanity. And that, therefore, that's the hermeneutical key to understanding the project of the entire council, which was to open the doors of the church, not to compromise with the world, but to open the church's treasury. And her treasury is Christ, and to bring that more openly into the world by engaging the world. And that was a thoroughly laudable goal. The trouble is it was carried forward with all kinds of deficiencies.
Thank you. Very
I mean,
clear.
not to put too fine a point on it, I would say this too. One of the things the council has in mind is, I don't want to go too much into it, but before the council, Catholic intellectualism, especially in seminary formation, had come to be dominated by a very narrow form of thinking that we call neo-scholasticism in the manuals and that sort of thing. And the manuals were fine as far as they went. They had a purpose and they served it well. But one of the things that they did not do was to engage modern philosophy, modern forms of thought, modern science, other than to basically dismiss it as contrary to the gospel. So, for example, you've got philosophers like Hegel or Kant or Heidegger or even Nietzsche who are raising serious points, and the neo-scholastics were simply intent on proving where these guys were wrong, but did not engage where they were maybe at least had some insights, or engage the fact that these guys were influential in the culture. De Lubac, in his book Drama of Atheist Humanism, kind of begins this demolition project towards neo-scholasticism, where he deals with Nietzsche and all these guys and says, we have a better proposal than these guys. So let's not be afraid of them. That's why John Paul always said, be not afraid, launch into the deep waters. Don't be afraid to engage the modern world in what the modern world is proposing, because we have a better proposal.
May I interject? You're saying, well, the issue would be neo-scholasticism because it's abstractness and theoretical framework. I agree with that. But in the late 70s and 80s, my experience has been the opposite, which means that was not neo-scholasticism rather than the idea that theology begins with praxis. It's not just the logos, rather than you begin with the ethos. In other words, many theologians who were studied, at least in Latin American seminarian, were pretty much the opposite. In other words, they gave primacy to history, to praxis, and so they became moralistic in many ways. So the moralism that you have in many preaching in Latin America is literally the opposite side. So when you try to explain or make an account of the Christian fact, beginning with Christ, they will really call you all the names in the book. So we have moved to the other extreme. So to keep one example, if I say, well, the foundation of human right is Christ, they say, no, that's fundamentalism. And so that is the phenomenon of liberation theology that today is becoming very important. And so what do you say about that? The tendency to reduce everything to ethics. And you hear many bishops talking about values, talking about moral principles, when the issue is Gaudium Spes 22.
Yes. Intellectual history is often characterized by a series of pendulum swings, and neo-scholasticism had become very sclerotic and narrow and was harming the church in some ways, and it needed to be dealt with. But in some ways too, The reaction against it was overly harsh, and the pendulum swang in the direction of the ressourcement theologians, who quickly found themselves marginalized by those who wanted to go beyond theology entirely and just reduce everything to ethics, as you said, in praxis. And so we go from a neo-scholasticism that is overly deductive and did not concern itself with
Right.
praxis, to a theology, if you would even call it a theology, that only wants to talk about praxis and then to build inductively some brand new theological scheme out of that without any critical awareness of whether or not the praxis needs correcting itself. And only truth can do that. Ratzinger was always talking about the eclipse of God and the eclipse of truth. And he spoke of the dictatorship of relativism along these lines, which is, and I think he was saying something very similar to what you're saying. So what we see now, fortunately, I think in certain Catholic academic circles in the United States, and that's really my main area of knowledge, is you see now certain Catholic theologians and philosophers who want to retrieve Thomistic forms of thinking, even in some of their neo-scholastic forms. They want to retrieve that, and they want it to interface with the insights of the ressourcement guys. I'm thinking of a theologian by the name of Matthew Leverine and a few others who are really spearheading this rapprochement between the ressourcement thinkers and the Thomists, precisely for the reason that you state, which is something was lost when the neo-scholastic dragon was killed. Something was lost, and what was lost needs to be retrieved. And what needs to be retrieved is reason rooted in God that produces truth in revelation that then deduces certain conclusions. And there's no substitute for that truth as a discerning spirit for praxis. Now, what to do about those who simply are going to dismiss this as they dismiss you as just, oh, you want to talk theology and reactionary stuff. The fact is, I think that a lot of Catholic bishops, priests, they preach in these moralizing ways and they speak in these broad and general categories because they don't think that people want to hear theology anymore. They think that people don't want to hear about God and Christ anymore. So they speak in this Esperanto language of social justice and human rights and moral concerns with the poor. And those are all well and good things. But then they just limit it to that because they're embarrassed by the gospel in the sense that they want social approval, and they know they're going to get social disapproval if they preach Christ and Christ crucified as the source of it all.
All right, Christopher, what next?
I don't know. I was just going to point on that. Sometimes I get the impression, though, that bishops will be speaking not based upon moral principles, but upon purely religious principles. Take a case in point, when they talk about immigration, they never talk about it rooting the Catholic teaching in natural law or in the nature of man. They will often make references to how Scripture calls upon us to receive the stranger, and they'll talk about compassion, the compassion of Christ. It seems to me that one of the difficulties, one of the problems we're having, is that we are not sufficiently rooted in philosophical principles in the church. I can't see, we can both speak from the perspective of revelation, but we must also speak from the perspective of nature. So yes, we get our dignity comes from Christ, but our dignity also comes from the fact that we even if Christ had never been incarnate, we would still have that dignity that would need to be respected. If there had been no revelation of Christ, there would still be that dignity. Very difficult to see, I think, and probably given our fallen nature, almost impossible for men to come to all the conclusions they would need to come to in regards to human dignity, but yet there. And I think if we're going to speak to the world, we have to root it in many ways in natural philosophy, in natural moral teaching, natural moral philosophy. And we have to link that to real world situations and say not only why these principles are true, but why they're applicable in the here and now. So.
Well, I think that's a great caveat to what I just said. I'll just, and it's a great comment, and it provokes a few somewhat disconnected thoughts in my brain. The first thing is that, yeah, bishops will often say, and speaking of immigration or refugees, they'll quote scripture here and there. But in my And the way I view it, oftentimes, the scripture quotes that they bring to bear are often sometimes the most generic of quotes. It's nice to be nice to the nice. Wasn't Christ a nice man?
Mhm.
Wasn't Christ good to the poor? I mean, these are all things that everybody can say, yeah, that's something we really liked about Christ. That's right. He was with the poor. And it's always good to be reminded of those things. But it seems toothless. It seems like a message without an edge, without a bite, without a prophetic witness. And so I'll just leave that there, that I often find it to be somewhat anodyne in how they present Revelation. The second thing is, you're absolutely right. As I said before, we have to teach people how to think, not just theologically, but philosophically. And we need definitely to resurrect certain forms of natural law thinking, a la Jacques Maritain and others, to help us in that process. However, and here is the problem, and I've done this too. I've engaged in natural law theorizing in debates with various intellectuals in the academic realm. The problem with natural law is that it makes no sense outside of faith in God. And I mean, this idea, in other words, that has crept up, that natural law philosophical reasoning represents some sort of kind of neutral discourse. And I'm not saying you're saying this, but a lot of people like the Whig Thomists would say this. It's some sort of natural, neutral discourse where we don't have to talk about Christ. We don't have to bring in all that hard gospel stuff. We can stay right here on this playing field established by secularity itself, that only certain forms of reason that are not tied to explicit revelation are allowed into the conversation. And so, okay, fine, we'll bring our little natural law reasoning in. But what is natural law reasoning? It's our rational ability to detect God's plan in creation. So now, if you don't accept that God created the world, and if you don't accept that Christ is the incarnate Son of God, and if you don't accept, therefore, that everything in nature, in terms of our own inherent teleologies as human beings and so on, have normativity, precisely because they're part of a divine plan, then you're not going to pay any attention to those teleologies. The interlocutor will simply say, well, why can't we change the teleology? Why can't we alter it? Why are teleologies normative in the first place? I don't believe in God. So natural law simply means to me common sense, and my common sense is different from your common sense. And so that to me is a problem with some purveyors of natural law reasoning as they enter into the public square, this bracketing off of the faith from natural law reasoning. Now, that doesn't mean you have to come full square, like a Billy Graham evangelist when you're talking to people. But in other words, what I'm advocating for is a form of philosophical discourse that is open to theology and not afraid to bring theological principles into the theological discourse, in order for the philosophical discourse to remain properly philosophical. This is one of the problems, I think, with the whole neo-scholastic approach, too, was that it drove this wedge between natural reason and theological reason. And one of the things Ratzinger and others are saying, no, it's Maritain himself. Read Maritain's great book, The Degrees of Knowledge, where he points out that as even our natural reason gets sort of higher and higher up on the scale of knowledge, it has to be more and more open to the mystical, more and more open to the theological and the supernatural, in order to remain properly reason itself as such. And I think the Schindlers are very, very, David and L. and David C. Schindler are very, very good at articulating this bringing together of a certain kind of Christian philosophical discourse. But anyway, like I said, those are some disconnected thoughts in response to your very good question. It's such an enormously complex question that it's hard to answer in a single podcast.
No, indeed it is. It's because you don't want to confound the principles of the two disciplines. And
No, not at all. But you know what? Here's why I think theology rooted in revelation can be a kind of guiding principle here. Ultimately, the guide for the relationship between philosophy and theology is the guide of the relationship between faith and reason. And the guide for that is the Chalcedonian definition of the relationship between Christ's humanity and his divinity, a real union, but the two natures still retain their own integrity as human and as divine, while still coming together in a union. And we've spent the past 1700 years trying to parse that out as to what in heck the full ramifications of that are. But it is at the very root of Christian humanism, and at the very root of any proper conception of the relationship in Christian thinking, anyway, between philosophy and theology.
I think maybe one thing, a particular issue, which probably underlines a lot of what you said, and a lot of specification we could make about on this whole topic, and a lot of questions I would have too. But anyway, the whole issue of the immorality of abortion. When you look at history, you see most, if not all, human societies have had some form of infanticide or abortion.
Yes.
And it's only really Christian societies which have forbidden abortion, have
Yes.
actually called out as immoral. So it suggests, at least, and our experience today suggests, that it's very, very difficult to see that abortion is unnatural, it's immoral by natural principles, and that the necessity, therefore, like in this particular case of revelation, is not that you need to draw your reasoning principles from revelation here, but that the revelation is there to God.
Yeah, it is very telling, isn't it, that outside of Christian societies, infanticide and abortion are routinely practiced. And it's because, I think it goes back to what I said. Natural law reasoning is great, but it's informed by faith. And absent that faith, just my own little thumbnail sketch here of the history of ethics or philosophical ideas on ethics is that inevitably societies tend towards, absent God, absent Christian revelation, societies tend towards an ethic of pragmatic utilitarianism. It's just the way human beings naturally think. They think in terms of consequences instead of principles. And if a principle is going to lead to consequences we don't necessarily want, like children that we don't want to have, the principle has to go away in the interest of expediency. And I, for example, in ancient Rome, I dare to say that most average people who would set their deformed child out on the hill to die of exposure, or they wanted a boy and they got a girl, probably did so with a certain sadness, a certain reluctance, a certain sense of guilt over the realization that they were essentially killing one of their children. But they felt the weight of pragmatic concerns. And those pragmatic concerns crowded out everything else. And let's not mince words here. I mean, pragmatic concerns can crush you. They can debilitate you in extreme ways. And people can be in extremis. And we have to, therefore, not just counter with Christian principles of moral clarity. We have to counter with compassion and mercy and service. We have to almost lead with that. Otherwise, our principles will come across as draconian and harsh.
You've mentioned Karl Barth and people who don't accept teleologies apart from self-made teleologies.
Yes.
And Barth famously said that you ought to preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. Now, on Sunday, day of reflection, the Los Angeles Times ran a piece on sex robots and how they're increasingly sophisticated and increasingly able to produce the kind of sexual pleasure that people really want. And the Times piece prophesied that surely this will be opposed by some, this is their word, Puritans. Puritans would oppose this. But the author said, all things considered, this is a good development, a very good development indeed. Now,
yes.
Here you are, a reader of the LA Times, knowing full well that if you write a scathing letter to the editor, it won't appear. But knowing full well that a great many people read the LA Times and a great many people are interested in advancing their sexual pleasure. And that might be so even in the classes you teach. And what do you say? What do you say?
Well, in one sense, I would say that this is a problem as old as humanity itself. There is nothing more, wonderful than the sexual union of a man and a woman in marriage. God has implanted into the sexual act extreme joy and pleasure on a physical but also emotional level. But for that very reason, eros is often distorted if it lacks agape. And I mean, Ratzinger points this out in his encyclical Deus Caritas Es. If eros doesn't eventually culminate in agape, it ceases even to be eros, because people eventually will be jaded to it, and it will lose its pleasure principle ultimately. Like taking a drug, you have to have ever higher doses of it. And so now, in a sense, the robots are simply an extension of the entire industry of sex toys and pornography and all forms of masturbatory forms of human sexuality. Um, and in many ways, what the sex robot represents both a danger, but also an admission of abject failure on the part of the culture to truly grasp the nettle of what honest eros is and what gives eros its true erotic dimension. Eventually, people will get tired of sex robots. And so what will be the next iteration of sexual titillation that we will then turn to? I mean, there's also the virtual reality headpieces that have been invented where you can you can conjure up sexual fantasies that are extremely real, which might actually be even more pleasurable than a stupid robot. But in lacking the interpersonal dimension of human eros and human sexuality, the sex toy craze, the sex virtual reality craze, the pornification craze, I think will eventually burn itself out. You know, it might burn itself out rather cataclysmically in forms of cultural destruction that we can't even imagine, that are already sort of happening in terms of families and marriages and young people. Um, but it can also fail in ways that return people to sanity. I remember once I heard a lecture by the French theologian Jean-Luc Maritain, who I like very much, and he was talking long before the invention of sex robots along these same lines. And he said it won't be too much longer before it'll just be devout Catholics that are having sex the old-fashioned way and having babies the old-fashioned way. And he goes, at some point, that's going to become attractive again. Like neckties that have gone out of style that come back into style. People will begin to realize, the Catholics might just be onto something here with regard to human sexuality, because our world is a dystopian world of eros for the sake of eros that is getting us nowhere. You know what? To go back to the thing about the Roman parents who felt probably remorse over, killing their child for whatever pragmatic reason. I have a great faith in the reservoir of goodness and sanity in most human beings. Yes, whole cultures can be corrupted. Good Germans can become Nazis almost overnight. Yeah, the mob mentality can kick in. But I continue to believe, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says, there's a freshness deep down things. And I think that is most especially true of the human heart. I think, for example, of things like transgenderism too, that you're seeing enormous backlash by ordinary people against that now. And people are waking up and they're saying, basta, enough is enough. And I think that how many people really will avail themselves of sex robots? Seriously. I think the vast majority of human beings will not avail themselves of sex robots because they have more sanity than that. They have more humanity than that. And so I do believe that if Catholics just persist on, don't cave into that trend, but double down on the message that we have, then I think that our day will come when sanity snaps back and the reservoir of goodness in people um, rises up and realizes that the Catholics were onto something.
So
Thank you. Go ahead, Mario.
following this, your response, you, I think, wrote something following Schindler about what would be the approach to today liberal democracy, and whether it would be weak Thomism, a modus vivendi prudentialism, integralism, and the prophetic eschatological stance. Which one do you think is more appropriate to our time?
Oh, clearly, since I'm a Catholic worker, I think it's the last one, the prophetic eschatological stance. Uh, let's start with integralism. All governments are ultimately integralist. All governments are ultimately confessional, and all governments are ultimately theological in some way or another, insofar as you cannot govern based on the common good without some notion of the good. And you can't have some notion of the good absent philosophical meta-narratives and metaphysics, whether these are implied or explicit. And so the question with regard to integralism isn't are we going to have an integralist government or not? It's going to be the quality and nature of the integralism involved. And I think too many Catholic integralists still have a kind of nostalgia, still kind of a hangover for a kind of Catholic confessional state that is coercive and denying religious freedom in subtle ways to other people other than Catholics. And I find this to be utterly unrealistic. There are more sophisticated iterations of integralism, and Adrian Vermeule and Waldstein and others. But I see no way, since most people think in stark political binaries and people think in utilitarian categories, most people are not going to read these 500-page long tomes on here's how you negotiate integralism properly without violating the rights of others. What they're going to hear is, oh, the Catholic Church is now in union with this particular government. The government has enshrined the Catholic Church as the privileged religion of the empire. And we're going to revert back to all kinds of negative stereotypes of the church as simply one power among many. And I think that is unfortunate. A government can only be confessional if the people it is governing share that confession. And otherwise you end up in so that's why I think the prophetic eschatological witness of simply viewing holiness, viewing our message, viewing our theology as a form in a broader sense of politics. William Cavanaugh, the theologian, speaks of this a lot, about theological politics as simply a countercultural witness, the creation of, in a sense, a society within a society that isn't necessarily competitive, but is martyrial, in the sense of being willing to go to martyrdom out of love for the world. This is Dorothy Day's vision. And I like that vision. Some see it as too contrarian, too competitive. They see it as too negative towards the American experiment. So then you end up with the Whig Thomists, people associated with First Things and others, Michael Novak, the late Richard Newhouse, George Weigel, these guys, all of whom I like very much. I once shared cigarettes and some nice scotch with George Weigel after a lecture he gave. We had a great conversation. He's a great guy. And I think he's changed his views somewhat. But at the end of the day, this project, which kind of started with John Courtney Murray in the 50s and 60s in the United States, that says, well, most of these modern constitutional democracies, be it England or America, places in Latin America that have moved towards democracy, they really have rooted in their constitutional order Thomistic principles, whether they realize it or not. For example, the American Constitution is rooted in English common law, which was itself rooted in medieval conceptions of common law and rights, which was in turn taken from Aquinas. So see there, America's actually crypto-Thomist. America's actually crypto-Catholic. And therefore we can take that First Amendment non-establishment clause as a kind of article of peace rather than an article of faith, and we can run with it. And then we can sprinkle a little Thomas Aquinas on top of the secular ice cream, and it's all going to come out great. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that neatly. And our culture, I think, has progressed way beyond this, the state where a little Thomas Aquinas is going to fix things. And I also reject the premise that the American constitutional order is ultimately rooted in Thomistic principles. I think it's ultimately more rooted in Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Rousseau, as David C. Schindler pointed out in his book, The Politics of the Real, which I reviewed, which I think you're referring to. Then you've got the sort of prudential path that says, look, we're not making any big claims about Thomistic principles or integralist confessional states. We don't want to take some grand prophetic stance. We simply want to reach some sort of agreement with the current order where we can sort of agree to carve out a space for ourselves where you just sort of leave us alone and we'll leave you alone, and we'll do our little sacrament thing and you do your taxation thing, and we'll all just be cool. We'll all just be grand. But I think that too is naive, precisely because the American state is a confessional state. And so here we even have a Catholic president who doesn't buy into Catholic faith, but American confessionalism. And so he's going to force upon the Catholic Church and her various agencies like foster agencies or adoption agencies. Oh, you have to place kids in gay families and so on. It's the law, take it or leave it. Or these contraception mandates in your insurance policies, or your abortion mandates in your take it or leave it. So this modus vivendi, this prudential, there's no stasis. It never remains the same. The wheels of justice are always churning in one direction or another. So I think we're in a bad way, actually. So that's I love America. I do. I love my homeland. I'm not a nationalist, but I am a patriot. And I think, like I said, there is a lot of wisdom in the American constitutional order. Political liberalism has a lot of insights that the church needs to lead. And I think Vatican II understood that, especially in Nostra Aetate Dignitatis Humanae, where it articulated a vision of religious freedom that took note, I think, of the fact that there are positive developments as well in the modern world. But the problem is that liberalism, despite its wonderful insights in some areas like of conscience, is ultimately rooted in a false metaphysics that is now unfolding before us in terms of its full implications.
Now, Christopher Zender is strong on metaphysics. He went to Thomas Aquinas College in its very first years. And maybe he'd like to add a little something here.
Well, I don't know what I want to add, but basically I'm in agreement on the whole with everything you said about the character of the American Republic, and especially the whole notion that we do live in a confessional state, that confession is of a different sort than the Catholic confession, and it's continually changing in some ways, though rooted in certain principles. So yeah, I mean, I've had many friends over the course of years who have held the Whig Thomism position, and never seemed to make any sense to me. Because, there really is no peace, as Eliot says, between the hammer and the anvil in the end.
That's great. Yeah, I like that. And I'm not saying at all that Thomas Aquinas doesn't have a lot to say to us right now, because I think he does. And I'm going to keep coming back to my mantra that we just need to keep doubling down on our best resources, on what we have in our treasury, and not lose heart, not lose our focus. And I think the Thomists in particular have a lot to teach us here. Go ahead.
Yeah. The thing is that, of course, Thomas wasn't a Whig.
No, exactly.
I mean, that's the whole problem.
Hardly. We have to somewhat bracket Thomas's own political views from the principles that he does develop.
Right.
With regard to things.
But I agree. The principles I think are essential. It's just the Whig Thomists seem to me take some of those principles, but not others. And they really don't have ultimately a concept of the common good.
Yes. And this is what David C. Schindler points out in his book, The Politics of the Real. I love that book. It's a great book. I think the end is a little confusing because it remains a bit obviously David C. Schindler believes that all states are confessional, and therefore what's wrong with investing the confessional state with a little Catholicism? And yet he has all of these caveats tossed in there but I don't mean this kind of confessional state, and I don't mean that kind of confessional state. So it remains a little ambiguous, but I think it has to remain. The reason why I still love the book is we're in an ambiguous situation. I mean, people are looking for silver bullets that are going to kill the demon. We're looking for nice and neat pat little answers, but we are in an enormously ambiguous situation culturally and politically. And it's going to take some organic development, the direction of which we probably don't even yet quite know. It's going to require history to unfold a little further, I think, in certain directions.
Larry, it's clear that the two of us have no truck with wigs.
Exactly. I don't.
We it's written all over our heads though.
Yeah.
We're not wig Thomists. However, looking ahead, down with the binaries, looking ahead, and we come to this consideration usually at the end of our shows. What do you think about the American Solidarity Party? Sean Dominique is a firm supporter. We're all of us here card-carrying members, and we want to know where you stand. Like, have you ever heard of it?
I have many Catholic friends who are members of the Solidarity Party, and they're constantly sending me via social media like Facebook, which is the Antichrist, yet somehow I'm still on it. These platform of the Solidarity Party.
Yes.
And so I like its platform very much. And if there was a Solidarity Party candidate for Senate or House of Representatives or, President of the United States, I would probably support that person as the best candidate among all possible options. But I would say that absent some sort of broader consensus along the lines of the principles that the Solidarity Party espouses, no elected Solidarity Party member will ever achieve anything in the current situation. They'll just run into roadblock after roadblock. And so, yeah, we're building a pile of sand, one grain at a time, and things can flip quickly in the political domain, especially in this day and age where things can go viral, ideas can go viral, and all of a sudden, boom, some trucker in New Jersey is elected to the Senate. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I read something about some trucker. Yeah. Anything is possible. On the other hand, I share Dorothy Day's distrust of electoral politics. And I mean, Dorothy Day did not vote at all because she considered it participation in an illusion. She believes that voting is simply the government's way of giving people the illusion of participation in a process that is ultimately ruled by the rich and the powerful elites, which is why no matter who we elect as president, nothing changes. No matter who you elect to Congress or the Senate, nothing changes, because the elected representatives are not really the engine that's driving the machine here. It is the well-greased corridors of power with money and influence. It's the military industrial complex. It's big tech, big pharma, corporate America. I hate to sound cynical and like some far left something or other, but these are all the reasons why Dorothy Day did not vote. And it's all the reasons why, even though I occasionally vote, I don't place much hope in it. And therefore, I don't place much hope in political parties, but I don't want to go all scorched earth on that either. These are prudential judgments, and different people make different judgments.
Point of order, as you know, she was a suffragette. First time she went to jail, it was for that cause. When asked why she never voted, her actual response was, "I've never found a good candidate."
Yeah.
Now, here in California, we have lots of good candidates. We're running 5 people.
But you know what? Dorothy Day was inconsistent. And I say that, and I consider her to be a saint, and I pray to her for her intercession. And I hope that she's canonized. But saints are not perfect. And Dorothy Day was inconsistent in how she applied sometimes her own insights and principles. So, for example, she was a pacifist, and yet she really did have a soft spot in her heart for Castro's revolution in Cuba. I mean, she wrote a piece in the Catholic Worker paper in 1962 where she said, "God bless Castro." And even the people reminded her, "Yeah, but that was a violent revolution." And she goes, "Well, yeah, but can't we at least have a certain soft spot in our hearts for somebody who uses violence to help the poor?" And at that time, perhaps it was possible to be naive about what Castro was up to. possible to be naive about Marxist revolutions bringing help to the poor and so on. And Dorothy Day seems to have bought into some of that naivete, I think. And so there she is blessing Castro, which was a violation of her own pacifism. And so, yeah, she was a suffragette, which was, and I think was urging people to have legislators, enact the constitutional amendment and so on. So she wasn't, in a sense, also therefore completely devoid of political orientations. So we have to understand that she was a complex figure, and even though she didn't vote, she was political. And so I keep my powder dry. I'm cynical about our electoral processes, but if a Solidarity Party candidate emerges who looks like he might have a solid chance at winning, I'll run to the voting booth.
All right, but the business about a solid chance of winning, that's only going to come after a time.
Yeah.
But I'm very glad that you called out Dorothy Day on the Castro thing. That is widely overlooked. It should not be overlooked. So good for you.
She later apologized for it somewhat. I think in 1976, she wrote a thing saying, look, obviously, that whole thing there in Cuba didn't turn out the way I thought that it would. And she was even a little bit sympathetic towards Mao Zedong's revolution in China because she considered Chiang Kai-shek's regime a puppet regime of capitalist colonialists and that was oppressing the Chinese people. And so she saw Mao as a kind of liberating figure and so on. But then she later apologized for that, saying, well, yeah, he turned out to be kind of a genocidal maniac, and Castro is not a friend of freedom. So she repudiated it somewhat, but you could tell she was still a little bit still like, yeah, it's just still a darn shame that such an opportunity was missed. And yeah.
Well, Pete Seeger finally wrote a song against Joe Stalin.
Meet Old Uncle Joe or whatever it was.
That took him a long
time because Seeger was criticized. I loved Pete Seeger. I used to go to his concerts. I sang along to Guantanamera when he would play. Yeah, but I hated his Stalinism, and
Yes.
I was glad that eventually he repudiated Stalin.
Well, as you no doubt know, on December 8th, the Archdiocese of New York is going to send its file, supposedly with 40,000 pages in it, to Rome to further the canonization process of Dorothy Day.
I think that is probably the day when Sean Domenici and I will be publishing our manifesto.
Yes, and that the fact that it got that far is already a miracle. The first of the two miracles necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll see what happens with that. My wife was part of a project to transcribe all of her handwritten correspondence into digitized form, which has proven to be, I think the archives are at Marquette, which has proven to be difficult because her handwriting was atrocious. So, but all these things are going forward. Yes.
Mario and Christopher, what say you at this point?
Say we probably should have the gospel.
What's that? I didn't hear that.
It's 11:19. Yeah.
We're out of time.
We are out of time.
Yeah.
But we always have time for the gospel for the day. And this is from Matthew. At that time, Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, went up on the mountain and sat down there. Great crowds came to him, having with them the lame, the blind, the deformed, the mute, and many others. They placed them at his feet and he cured them. The crowds were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the deformed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind able to see. And they glorified the God of Israel. Jesus summoned his disciples and said, my heart is moved with pity for the crowd, for they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, for fear they may collapse on the way. The disciples said to him, where could we ever get enough bread in this deserted place to satisfy such a crowd? Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? 7, they replied, and a few fish. He ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and the fish, gave thanks, broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples, who in turn gave them to the crowds. They all ate and were satisfied. They picked up the fragments left over, 7 baskets full. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Excellent.
Thank you, Larry, so
Thank
much
you
for
very
joining
much.
us.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
discussion. Thank you, Mario, for tracking this fellow down.
Thank you.
Thank to all of you. It was a great conversation. I enjoyed it immensely.
All right.
Thank you.
Godspeed.